There we go. Technical difficulties, folks. Technical difficulties. Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Spilling Tea. I'm your host, Tiffany Daniels. And yes, we are going back to our Medicaid series, and we are going to be finishing out today going over Medicaid and its role in regards to supported employment. Mainly going through this documentation so you can get an idea about how many of us have access to, has used, is using, or could possibly be using in the future that supported employment help that gets the majority of its funding mostly from Medicaid. So it's just going to be a little bit of a short one. I say now, we all know that's famous last words coming from me. And then tomorrow we're going to go ahead and continue with Medicaid and taking a look into a couple of different things. To finish out the weekend, we're going to be taking a look in regards to Medicaid funding and assisted living apartments, which is very different from group homes, which we'll be going through all of that tomorrow. Most of the assisted living apartments for people with developmental disabilities in particular take pretty much the entirety of their funding from Medicaid waivers, especially out here. I know quite a bit on the subject because when I first came out of high school as a person who was in those transition age services that go from high school into secondary education or into the workforce, I was, for the first 6 years out of high school, actually in one of those assisted living apartments. So we're going to be going over that, and then afterwards the Medicaid series is going to be going into a bit of a different direction. We're going to be talking about the fact that Medicaid funding plays a major role when it comes to funding for special education. Something that is already gutted to the bone, with many special ed teachers having to buy supplies for their students out of their own pockets because there's just not enough money to go around, and what kind of threat the cuts to Medicaid could have on special ed as well as everything else we've been going through here. So we're going to get through the trigger warnings real quick, and then we'll go ahead to where we left off on last Saturday. Alright folks, trigger warning. We do get this channel marked not for kids for a reason. We do use profanity, and we do speak on some pretty dark topics. So if you have a child, they are 16 and younger, and they are watching this, very much parental supervision is very much advised. Also, trigger warning. When you come to this channel, you are going to very much hear my political views. The main reason being those political views have to do specifically with all the things that we go over on this channel. I do not like either side out in the United States. Both sides have essentially used people like myself, the disability community, as pawns in their own sick game against one another, and then abandoned us as soon as we are no longer useful to them, only to be picked up again when the next political campaign comes around. So, if that bothers you, this is probably not the type of videos you want to be watching, but I still do encourage you to go to the description box. That's where everything we're going over in regards to the looming threat of the cuts to Medicaid, you're going to see all those linked in there. I'm still going to go ahead and encourage you to read those. Alright, now some of this is going to be a reread, and then there's a couple of tables to look at, and we will be done with this part in regards to Medicaid funding and supported employment. So, identification strategy for beneficiaries with a disability, which is our primary focus here. Because supported employment has been proven to help people with disabilities obtain employment, we use the TAVRIP to identify the subpopulation of beneficiaries with a disability. Typically, a person with a disability is defined as someone who has a physical, intellectual, or mental impairment that limits his or her ability to perform major life activities, such as caring for oneself, walking, or seeing. Now, when it comes to people like myself back in the day, it was a lot less narrow of a scope when we were talking about major life activities. In particular, issues in getting a job due to not being very good with communicating with neurotypicals. Let's just put it that way so, I don't end up embarrassing myself. I will quote Monty Python though, just real quick. I got better after trading myself relentlessly, OCD style. People with disabilities might be eligible for Medicaid through multiple pathways, including through receipt of supplemental security income. Again, eventually, that is going to be its own series, but with everything popping off now politically and the disability community getting hit on pretty much all sides, I'm trying to do as best I can, folks, but it always feels like I'm running behind, so just be patient with me. We will be going over supplemental security income because it is really not the same thing as overall more traditional Social Security. It's a bit of a different animal, bit of different criteria, and of course we have the looming threat to that as well as the regular Social Security most people are more familiar with. Alright? Okay. We used enrollment records in the DE file and claims files to identify people with disabilities. In the TAVRIP DE file, states place beneficiaries into different eligibility groups based on the state's eligibility determination process. Some of these groups are associated with people with disabilities, and we used them for this analysis. So those of us who got in on waivers, such as moi, back in the day, that's what they're referring to. People like us who utilize that Medicaid funding as a part of one of the supported employment programs. The one I specifically used literally had to do with nothing else but getting folks like myself with developmental disabilities community-based employment. States can also indicate if a beneficiary is enrolled in a program for people with disabilities, such as an enrollment in the 1915 waiver, like we just talked about a second ago. State plan options, PACE, which is gaining more traction out here, but still the majority is through the more traditional, you get Medicaid, you go into supported employment through one of the providers such as ARC, Easter Seals, or Burrell. Well, actually, no, not Burrell. Burrell doesn't have that program. I know Easter Seals does. I know that ARC does. And those are the two big ones out here. I know there's some others out in a few other states. I'm not quite as familiar with them as I am with Easter Seals and ARC. We used these indicators from DE file to identify beneficiaries with a disability. Besides enrollment records, we identified claims in the IP, LT, and OT files that had 1915C, 1915I, 1915J, or 1915K services, which we presume to be services for beneficiaries with a disability. I want you to highlight the word assumed in there. We put that stuff in there for a reason. Mainly, it's to cover for the fact that we don't know absolutely 100%. Because mainly the way different states code different things in regards to this funding, there's not like a platform like essentially everybody uses coding that is the same across the board. My state's gonna be different from California. California is going to be different from Rhode Island. Rhode Island is going to be different from Kansas. You see where we're going there, right? Exactly. So it makes it a little bit more difficult in regards to getting those numbers, just because there are so many differences between each state in regards to how the waivers are coded it makes it difficult to get a precise and more exact number. I know that they're working on it, and there has been talk for years for where everyone is using the same type of coding so that we can all be on the same page. But as it stands right now, it's still different depending on your state. We also search for claims associated with a stay in an intermediate care facility for people with intellectual disability, which we also presume to be claimed for a beneficiary with a disability. Enrollment records and claims might not reveal all people with disabilities. We can find beneficiaries with a disability using the determination of their eligibility for Medicaid enrollment, such as their Medicaid ability determined by enrollment in supplemental security income. Now guys, I know we read through this last time. I know we're rehashing it, but we're getting ready to get to the table, so I kind of wanted to go through it and read it again, so once we're looking at the tables, we're not confused. Especially me. I've had special autistic fog brain for the last 2 days. Send help. However, beneficiaries might meet multiple eligibility criteria, which may or may not indicate they have a disability. Using claims might identify more people with a disability, but not all people with a disability receive types of services that indicate their disability status. Exactly what I'm saying. The coding is so different from state to state that there's, at this point, no way to be able to pin it down yet. When using service claims to identify beneficiaries with a disability, we used a 2-year look-back period. That is, the beneficiary must have had a qualifying claim in 2018 to 2019 to be identified as a beneficiary with a disability in 2019. It is possible that a beneficiary did not meet any of the 4 criteria but still had a disability. Remember that even that's changed. Back when they changed it in the 2010s and I got dropped from the majority of my supports, it was 3 major life skills. Now it is jumped up for 4. This is what I mean when I say every time there is cuts to Medicaid, the criteria for eligibility has to be revamped, because otherwise there's just not enough money to be able to go around for everyone. So we'll get into that more here. There's several problems that I have in regards with how funding is. We'll get into it. I'm not going to dig myself into a hole today. At least not yet. The day is young. Let me continue here. When using service claims to identify beneficiaries with we went 2019. It is possible that a beneficiary did not meet the 4 criteria. Now we're going into identification strategy for beneficiaries with a chronic condition. This is a little bit different from where my primary expertise is. I do still want to go ahead and go through it though, because there are a few folks who do have the more chronic that actually utilize the services through one way or another. So, the method used to identify beneficiaries with a disability cannot determine the type or the severity of the disabling conditions. For example, an enrollment record might indicate that a beneficiary is participating in a 1915C waiver, but it will not provide the details on the 1915C waivers focus group. So if you were to take a look at mine, it would tell you that yes, I did utilize under a Medicaid waiver to be able to use supported employment services through ARC. What you're not going to see under that waiver with that paperwork is that it names what my disability is. Whether it was something that's chronic, whether it's more of a sudden illness, or anything of that nature. We therefore use a different algorithm to detect potential chronic conditions as a beneficiary might have, whether we identify the person as having a disability. We identify behavioral health and other chronic conditions and claims data using the CMS standardized approach, which is available from the CCW5. The CCW algorithm uses diagnosis and procedure codes to identify beneficiaries with a chronic condition. We use this algorithm to find beneficiaries with other potentially disabling conditions not included in the disability identification methodology described previously. Table A1 lists the disorders identified by the algorithm as chronic conditions, including disorders in the behavioral health category. So here's the tables that I was telling you we were going to get to. Okay, so this is A1, behavioral health and chronic conditions identified using the CCW algorithm. Now, I do want to say there is this weird thing in particular with ADHD and with autism where you can find us under both umbrellas of developmental disabilities and behavioral health. That does come across, but a good majority of us that have worked inside of this field, as well as those of us who actually carry the diagnosis, which hi, I'm both, usually refer to ourselves as folks who have a developmental disability, or the old terminology I believe was developmental delay, right? So we kind of fall in both categories. Just kind of weird little tad bit. I know it's kind of not related what we're talking about. If I find something interesting and it sticks in my head, I'm the person that's going to point it out. Just saying. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is included in the behavioral health category. Anxiety, bipolar disorder, depressive disorder, depression, personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, other psychotic disorder, other mental illness, alcohol use disorder, drug use disorder, opioid use disorder. Other chronic condition categories: Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, cystic fibrosis, other metabolic disorder, epilepsy, intellectual or developmental disability, musculoskeletal condition, sensory impairment, stroke, transient ischemic heart attack, traumatic brain injury, and non-psychotic mental disorders due to brain damage, other disabling or chronic condition. Alright, A. The CCW algorithm examines certain service use patterns during a 2-year reference period to identify beneficiaries with a chronic condition during a particular year. The algorithm identifies a beneficiary as having been treated for a chronic condition if the beneficiary has 1 inpatient or 2 outpatient or residential claims for treatment of a chronic condition on different dates of service. B. The other chronic conditions include acquired I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to butcher this word so bad, my warning in advance. Hypothyroidism. I'm just going to say HY. Can I say HY? I don't need to be embarrassing myself like this. Atrial fibrillation, acute myocardial infarction, anemia, asthma, benign prostatic hyperplasia, colorectal cancer, endometrial cancer, female or male breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, cataracts, glaucoma, heart failure, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and bronchitis, diabetes, fibromyalgia, and chronic pain and fatigue, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, ischemic heart disease, viral hepatitis, human immunodeficiency virus and or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome such as HIV or AIDS, leukemias and lymphomas, liver disease, cirrhosis and other liver conditions, migraine and chronic headache, multiple sclerosis and transverse myelitis, obesity, peripheral vascular disease, pressure and chronic ulcers, spina bifida, and other congenital anomalies of the nervous system, tobacco use disorders, and sickle cell disease. Alright, this is Appendix B. We're going by state here. Beneficiaries using supported employment per the 1,000 Medicaid and CHIP beneficiaries. And this is going to be one of the most important tables here, okay? Now, they kind of got each of these here. I think it's in the millions, but let me see. Yes, okay. Well, I'm just going to read the numbers as they have them so I don't, dig myself into a hole. Alabama says DQ, Alaska 2.7, Arizona 5.2, Arkansas 0.3, California 0.8, Colorado 3.4, Connecticut 7.4, Delaware 4.8, District of Columbia 6.2, Florida DS, Georgia 11.2, Hawaii 0.2, Idaho 3.5, Illinois 0.5, Indiana DS, Iowa 9.1, Kansas DQ, Kentucky 0.7, Louisiana 1.5, Maine 3.6, Maryland 3.3, Massachusetts 3.4, Michigan DQ, Minnesota 11, Mississippi 1.4, Missouri 2.1. You notice how Missouri is one of the ones that has just kind of a slightly higher rate. It's because we've got quite a few ARC offices out here. You get some pretty decent access to supported employment programs out here in Missouri, especially if you are kind of in the more southwest region. Because even if you are out in the rural areas in this part of the state, usually to get into my city, it is about a pretty much quick drive. I'd say at the very most an hour to about 45 minutes, depending on which highway you're taking and what traffic looks like. So it gives us a little bit better access to those supports through supported employment over here. Montana 2.2, Nebraska 7.9, Nevada 0.5, New Hampshire 11.9, New Jersey 1.7, New Mexico 0.4, and New York 2.1. Now, this next one here, this is the beneficiaries using supported employment per 1,000 Medicaid and CHIP beneficiaries. So, a few bit more in the number there. Well, actually, I think I'm just reading down from the other list. I'm sorry. I have fog brain. And also, I should have included in the trigger warnings. It's amateur hour over here, folks. I don't know how to edit these videos, and it's just too long to just hash it and redo the video. So please be patient with me. All right, North Carolina 3.1. We don't have it for North Dakota. Ohio is sitting at 6.1. Oklahoma 3.7. Pennsylvania 3. Oregon 3. Pennsylvania 1.6. Puerto Rico 0. Rhode Island, we don't have the numbers for that. South Carolina 2.9. South Dakota 11.1. We don't have the numbers for Tennessee. For Texas, we have 0.4. Utah did not include the information. Looks like neither did Vermont or the Virgin Islands. Virginia 1.7, Washington 8.6, West Virginia 0.6, Wisconsin 4.9, and Wyoming 7.7. Now the DQs we've been saying, unable to report because data for the populating the cell have unusable quality. DS, where we're seeing that pop up in some of these tables, data are suppressed because the state had fewer than 11 people using supported employment services, where the state had the second lowest count of people for the year to prevent calculation of suppressed data cell. Alright, and as you see, we are finally done with this documentation here, folks. And tomorrow we are going to be moving on into funding, in particular by means of Medicaid in regards to assisted living apartments. I'm going to be in particular focusing on those assisted living apartments that are for folks like myself who are developmentally disabled. I mean, I will get into the elderly assisted living as well. We'll start going into Medicare, but I'm going to separate it out to be its own series, and we'll start going through that one by one too, just to make it a little bit less confusing. Because as you can see, autistic fog brain is autistic fog brain, and sometimes I forget how to say words. It helps. Anyways, folks, we're going to go ahead and close out for today. We don't get very many views on this channel, and the few we do tend to get removed from time to time. So if you could, please don't forget to hit the like button, hit subscribe. Please, folks, don't forget to utilize the comments. We definitely do hope you have a good one. And, yeah, we'll see you next time.